Hi friends. Welcome back. If you're new here, grab a seat because you are not going to want to walk away from this one. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime and investigative stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Now, there is a specific kind of silence that settles over a suburban neighborhood at night. A neighborhood where the houses are close together, where porch lights glow orange and yellow, where dogs bark in the distance at nothing in particular. Hopkins, Minnesota, November 3rd, 2008. A Monday. The kind of night so unremarkable that not a single neighbor would remember it. Not a single passerby would think to look twice. Cold the way November in Minnesota is always cold. That specific, biting, damp cold that gets into the bones of anyone not born to it, and sometimes even those who were. Somewhere on a quiet residential street in this suburb, just west of Minneapolis, a 17-year-old boy walked out of his family's home. He was wearing jeans, a gray sweater. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't say goodbye. His family assumed it was just another evening. Maybe he was going to meet friends. Maybe he needed air. 17-year-old boys disappear into the night all the time, and they always come back. That's just what they do. But Abdikadir Ali Abdi did not come back. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not ever. And what his family would eventually discover, weeks later, then months later, then years later, would shatter the ordinary world they had spent so long trying to build. Because Abdikadir Ali Abdi didn't run away in the way people sometimes imagine when they hear the words, missing teenager. He didn't end up in another city, or with another family, or sleeping in a shelter somewhere in the cold. The truth, when it finally arrived, was worse than anyone could have prepared for. He had crossed an ocean. He had crossed into a war. And the organization he walked toward had a name that, by 2008, was already making governments tremble. Al-Shabab. The FBI would eventually classify him as a fugitive. Federal charges would be filed. His name would appear on a government wanted list. And 17 years later, as of this video, Abdikadir Ali Abdi is still in hiding. Not in Minnesota, not in America, but in Mogadishu, Somalia. A grown man shaped entirely by the years that followed that Monday night departure. A man who left home as a teenager in a gray sweater and who has never been able to go back. This is his story. But to understand it, to truly understand how a 17-year-old boy in suburban Minnesota ends up in one of the most violent terrorist organizations on the planet, you cannot start at the moment he walked out the door. You have to go back much further than that. You have to understand what the world looked like to him, and to the family that raised him, and to the community that surrounded him. You have to understand what it means to be the child of people who survived something unsurvivable, who crossed the world to give you safety, and who couldn't quite predict what that safety would cost. Because this is not just Abdikadir's story. It is the story of a generation. Minnesota, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, had become something remarkable. Quietly, steadily, almost without announcement, the Twin Cities had become home to the largest Somali diaspora community in the entire United States. People arrive in waves when catastrophe sweeps through a country, and Somalia had seen catastrophe upon catastrophe: civil war, famine, government collapse, warlords, violence so widespread and so normalized that entire childhoods were built around it. And so people left. They left because they had to. They left because staying meant dying. They walked across borders and waited in camps and filled out paperwork and prayed and waited some more. And when the doors opened, many of them found themselves in a place as far from the Horn of Africa as could be imagined. The frigid, flat, landlocked heartland of America. By the early 2000s, Minneapolis and its surrounding suburbs were home to somewhere around 30,000 Somali immigrants. Some estimates put it higher. And within that community, a community of mosques and halal markets, of Somali-owned restaurants and community centers, of parents who worked overnight shifts and children who went to American public schools. There was an entire second world being quietly negotiated every single day. The negotiation looked like this: you are Somali. You are Muslim. You are black in an America that is not always kind to any of those things simultaneously. Your parents remember a homeland. You do not. Your parents speak Somali at home and watch Somali news and grieve Somali losses. You speak English at school and play American video games and listen to American music and are told, in 100 small ways, every single day, that you don't quite belong. Not fully. Not completely. Not in the way that actually feels like belonging. And belonging, when you are 17, is the only thing in the entire universe that matters. Abdikadir Ali Abdi was part of this generation. He was raised in Hopkins, a suburb that sits about 8 miles west of downtown Minneapolis. Hopkins is not a large place, a small town feel pressed up against the edge of a major metro area. The Somali community there was not as large or as visible as the communities in Cedar Riverside, the Minneapolis neighborhood that had become something of a cultural hub for Somali Americans. Hopkins was quieter, more dispersed. What we know about Abdikadir's specific childhood is limited. Court documents and news accounts give us outlines, not portraits. His brother Yonis Abdi testified at a later federal trial, and through that testimony, small pieces of the picture emerged. He prayed with his brother. They went together, sometimes, to the Somali Mall, one of those remarkable community spaces that had grown up around the diaspora, full of Somali food and clothing and music and the sound of the Somali language filling the air in a place where it was otherwise nowhere to be found. He was, by all accounts, a young man embedded in his community, rooted in it, even. And yet, the second generation of Somali Americans occupied a space that had no template. Their parents had come from a country that no longer existed in the form they remembered. They were raising children in a country that didn't fully claim them. And the children themselves, particularly the boys, particularly the young men, were growing up in a specific American moment that was thick with tension. September 11th, 2001, had happened. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq had happened. The word Muslim had become, in the American imagination, something charged and frightening, and every Somali Muslim teenager in every American city felt that charge every single day. They felt it in the way teachers looked at them, in the way classmates sometimes went silent around them, in the way the news talked about people who shared their faith, their names, their faces. There was a weight to being young and Muslim and black in post 9/11 America that is difficult to fully articulate, and the young men who carried that weight found different ways to manage it. Some built walls. Some built bridges. Some buried themselves in school, in work, in faith. Some got angry. Some got lost. And some, when the right voice came along at the right moment offering the right answer, listened. In 2006, something happened in Somalia that set everything in motion. Ethiopia, Somalia's neighbor, historically a rival, invaded the country, citing its own security concerns and the backing of the African Union and the United States. For many Somalis, the Ethiopian invasion was not a geopolitical event to be analyzed at a safe distance. It was a wound. It was the latest in a long series of violations against a people who had already been violated enough. And within the Somali diaspora in Minnesota, in the mosques, in the community centers, in the living rooms and halal restaurants and late-night gatherings, it became a subject of burning conversation. Into that burning conversation stepped al-Shabab. Al-Shabab, the name means the youth in Arabic, had begun recruiting in Minneapolis as early as 2005, centered in and around the Abubakar as-Siddiq Islamic Center. But after the Ethiopian invasion, their message found new urgency. They were not, initially, positioning themselves as a terrorist organization in the way that term gets understood in the West. They were positioning themselves as resistance, as defenders of Somaliland and Somali people, as a force that would do what governments had failed to do and would push the invaders back. And to a young man who felt disconnected from America, who felt the pull of a homeland he'd never seen, who was angry and unmoored and searching for something that felt like purpose. That message sounded, in the beginning, like an answer. Abdikadir Ali Abdi was 14 years old when Ethiopia invaded Somalia. He was 16 when the first wave of young Minnesota men began disappearing, boarding planes quietly, telling their families they were going to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj pilgrimage, and then surfacing in Mogadishu. He was 17 when he left. By the time he walked out of his house in that gray sweater, the machinery had already been running for over a year. Secret meetings in Minneapolis restaurants. Calls from Somalia encouraging friends still in Minnesota to come. Online propaganda videos, some of the most explicit and violent of any jihadi organization, according to terrorism researchers, circulating through the community. An older network of recruiters who knew exactly which young men to approach, and when, and what to say. But none of that tells us everything. Because machinery doesn't recruit people. People recruit people. And the question that haunts this case, the question that Abdikadir's own brother sat with for years after his testimony, the question that community leaders in Minneapolis still ask, is this: at what exact moment did a teenager who went to the Somali mall and prayed with his brother and wore jeans and a gray sweater decide that a war zone was where he needed to be? There is no clean answer. There never is in stories like this. What there is a night in November, a quiet suburban street, a boy who walked out the door, and a family who had absolutely no idea what was coming. His brother Yonis didn't report him missing immediately. Why would he? 17-year-olds leave the house. They come back. It was only days later, after Abdikadir had not come back, after calls went unanswered, after the particular silence that follows a vanishing had settled in, that Yonis went to the Hopkins police. He told them his brother was missing. He told them his brother was 17 years old. What Yonis didn't know yet was that by the time he walked into that police station, his brother was already on the other side of the world. And what was waiting for Abdikadir on the other side of the world was nothing like what he had been told to expect. To understand what pulled Abdikadir Ali Abdi out of Hopkins, Minnesota, and toward a war in East Africa, you have to understand the specific architecture of what happened in the Twin Cities between 2005 and 2008. Because this was not a spontaneous eruption. This was not a handful of young men independently deciding, all at once, to travel to Somalia. What federal investigators would eventually call Operation Rhino, a multi-year FBI investigation into a jihadi recruiting pipeline, revealed something far more organized, far more intentional, and far more terrifying in its precision. It started at a mosque. The Abubakar as-Siddiq Islamic Center on Minneapolis' south side was a gathering place, a cultural anchor for a community still finding its footing in a new country. The mosque leadership would later strongly reject any suggestion that the institution itself was complicit in recruitment. But the record shows that around 2005, men connected to al-Shabab began appearing in and around the mosque's orbit. They were not standing at the door handing out pamphlets. That is not how this works. They were in the conversations, in the small gatherings after prayer, in the quiet moments when a young man was sitting alone and a trusted older figure sat down beside him. The methodology, when it eventually emerged through court proceedings and testimony, was built on something disturbingly simple. Find the boys who are struggling. Find the ones who feel like they don't belong. Find the ones who are angry about what's happening in Somalia, angry about the Ethiopian invasion, angry about the way the world talks about their people. Sit with them. Listen to them. Agree with them. Validate the anger. Give it a frame. And then, slowly, carefully, offer the frame a door. Youth is more like action, not talk. Abdikadir would later say in his 2020 interview with VOA's Investigative dossier program. We thought money is not enough, so we have to do action. Those words tell you everything and nothing at the same time. They tell you about a young man who wanted to do something real, something that mattered, something that translated the abstract pain of his community's situation into concrete movement. They tell you about the specific vulnerability of teenage boys who are full of energy and idealism and have not yet learned to be afraid. And they tell you, quietly, that the recruiters knew exactly which buttons to press. Secret meetings began in October 2007. Salah Osman Ahmed, one of the young men who would later return to the United States and cooperate with prosecutors, told a judge that he attended gatherings in Minneapolis that started that fall. They met in restaurants. In one early meeting, a group of young men sat in the private dining room of a pizza place, gathered in a circle on the floor, and listened to a phone call, a live call, piped in from Somalia, from an al-Shabab member. The voice on the phone told them about the duty to defend Muslim land, about the Ethiopian invaders who were desecrating Somali soil, about the glory that awaited those who stood up and fought. And then the voice asked, "Who among you is ready?" The conspirators also met in cars, parked in quiet spots around Minneapolis, in mosques, in corners of rooms after services had ended. The conspiratorial atmosphere was, according to terrorism researchers, deliberate. The conspiratorial air is part of this group bonding, explained one expert. It created a sense of inner circle, of brotherhood, of being chosen for something important. It made the young men feel seen, and special, and necessary. Feelings that are catnip to anyone who has spent years feeling invisible. The man who would eventually be convicted as a central architect of this pipeline was Mohammed Said Omar, not to be confused with Ahmed Ali Omar, who would travel to Somalia with Abdikadir. Mohammed Said Omar was a 46-year-old janitor at a local mosque, a middle-aged man who had been part of the community for years. He was the neighbor who said hello every morning. The man families trusted. Court proceedings would reveal that he played a key role in organizing and partially funding the travel of more than 20 young men to Somalia. He helped with logistics, with money, with plans. He was extradited from the Netherlands and convicted at trial, eventually sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. But Mohammed Said Omar was not acting alone. He was part of a wider network, some of it physically present in Minneapolis, some of it operating through phones and internet from Somalia. And the internet piece of this deserves its own attention, because in 2007 and 2008, al-Shabab's online propaganda operation was unlike anything law enforcement had encountered before. Terrorism consultant Evan Coleman, who studied al-Shabab's media during this period, was explicit. Their videos were, in his words, among the most explicit, the most violent, and the most enthusiastic videos of any jihadi organization out there. They were crafted to speak directly to English-speaking audiences. Some featured men with covered faces firing automatic weapons, practicing martial arts, marching with purpose. Others showed English-speaking fighters recording last wills before suicide bombings. There was a man who called himself Abu Mansour the American, a real person, an American who had joined the group, who appeared in videos commanding fighters and eulogizing fallen jihadists. It was recruitment content designed to make the life of an al-Shabab fighter look purposeful, meaningful, heroic. For a teenager who felt like an outsider in the country he was born in, who had grown up watching news reports about American military action in Muslim lands, who prayed in a mosque and identified with a homeland he'd barely seen. These videos were not just recruitment material. They were mirrors. They reflected back an identity that felt more complete than the fractured one he was carrying around in Hopkins, Minnesota. And there was another element that the later testimony made devastatingly clear. The young men who left in the first wave, the ones who went in late 2007, stayed in contact with their friends back in Minneapolis. They called. They messaged. They told the friends they left behind what it was like over there. They encouraged them to come. The recruitment, in other words, was not just top-down from al-Shabab operatives to passive teenagers. It became lateral, peer-to-peer, friend recruiting friend, brother recruiting brother, across a network of relationships that law enforcement struggled to see, let alone disrupt. Ahmed Ali Omar was one of the young men who had already gone. He had left Minneapolis in late 2007 at the age of 19, having initially dreamed of becoming a doctor after high school. What changed his trajectory? The same forces that were reshaping the trajectories of dozens of young men in his community. The Ethiopian invasion, the propaganda, the secret meetings, the voice of somebody he trusted telling him that his community needed him, that going to Somalia was not abandonment of his American life, but fulfillment of his deeper obligation. By the time Abdikadir was being pulled toward the same decision in 2008, Ahmed Ali Omar was already in Somalia. And the reports coming back, the calls, the messages, the conversations whispered between young men in Minneapolis, painted a picture of purpose and brotherhood and meaning that was intoxicating to someone who hadn't yet seen the reality. When we try to reconstruct what Abdikadir's final weeks and months in Hopkins looked like, the available record is frustratingly thin. He was not, as far as his brother's testimony revealed, visibly connected to Mohammed Said Omar. Yonis told the court he had never seen his brother with the man. The passport at his mother's house suggests that the travel was arranged under a different document, through a separate channel. The recruits, according to documented patterns, typically traveled with Somali passports rather than American ones, booked flights via Chicago or Boston to Amsterdam or Dubai, and then connected to Mogadishu. They went in small groups, but booked separate planes, creating a paper trail that looked like individual travel rather than coordinated movement. What is documented is that multiple young men left Minneapolis in the same cluster of days in November 2008. Jamal Ais Sheikh Bana, a 20-year-old college student, left in those same days. He would be dead within a year, killed in Somalia. Abdikadir Ali Abdi, 17 years old, left in the same period. And somewhere in the weeks leading up to that departure, In conversations we cannot fully reconstruct, in meetings in quiet corners and late-night phone calls, and maybe in the particular silence of a young man sitting with something he could not yet name, a decision was made. The family, afterward, tried to piece it together. The passport was still in the house. That means he had to have obtained a second one through channels his mother didn't know about. The listed mailing address on the passport application turned out to be a location his family never lived at, a detail that emerged during Mohammed Said Omar's trial, where prosecutors displayed the applications. Someone had helped him. Someone had been managing the logistics. Someone who knew how to move young men across an ocean without their families noticing until they were already gone. When Yonis Abdi went to the Hopkins police and reported his brother missing, the investigation moved quickly from local law enforcement to the FBI. Because by November 2008, the FBI was already aware that young men were disappearing from Minneapolis. They were already running Operation Rhino. They already knew that a pipeline existed. What they were still trying to do was trace every strand of it, name every participant, establish every connection. And so the news that another 17-year-old had vanished, this one from Hopkins, this one named Abdikadir Ali Abdi, was not a mystery to investigators. It was, devastatingly, a pattern. The community was already in shock. In October 2008, just weeks before Abdikadir left, Sherwa Ahmed, a 26-year-old Minneapolis man, had become the first documented American suicide bomber. He drove a vehicle loaded with explosives into a United Nations compound in northern Somalia. His face appeared on the news. His name was attached to a history-making atrocity. And the Somali American community in Minneapolis, already living under a microscope, already managing the impossible weight of being painted with the same brush as extremists they had nothing to do with, was reeling. "We feel doubly victimized," said Nimco Ahmed, a Somali community activist who knew many of the young men involved. "To lose our children and brothers to terrorism, and to be painted as terrorists ourselves. That is the world Abdikadir Ali Abdi left behind him when he walked out into the November night. A community grieving. A family who had no idea. An FBI investigation that was widening every week. And somewhere in the dark, a plane ticket with his name on it, booked under a passport his mother didn't know he had. He was 17 years old, and the worst of what was waiting for him hadn't even begun yet. The morning after Abdikadir Ali Abdi walked out of his family's home in Hopkins, there would have been an ordinary silence. The kind that doesn't yet feel like absence. Parents who work long hours, as many in the Somali immigrant community did, taking the overnight shifts and the double shifts and the jobs that most other people passed over, often missed the small rhythms of their teenagers' days. A son who wasn't at the breakfast table could be sleeping, could have left early, could be at the mosque for morning prayer. For a few days, that ordinary silence held. Then it didn't. Yonis Abdi, Abdikadir's brother, would later tell a federal court that he last saw his brother on November 2, 2008, the day before the disappearance his family would remember as November 3rd. He said he had no idea his brother was planning to travel anywhere. He said the passport, the official family passport, the one his mother kept, was still at the house. He said everything had seemed normal. And then his brother was gone. When Yonis went to the Hopkins police, the conversation probably began in the way those conversations always begin. A missing teenager. An address. A physical description. Black hair. Black eyes. Gray sweater. 17 years old. The officers would have taken down the information. Would have opened a file. Would have entered a name into a database. And then the conversation would have shifted because the Hopkins police were not operating in isolation. By the fall of 2008, law enforcement across the Twin Cities was aware that something was happening, that young Somali men were disappearing in a way that did not fit the profile of ordinary runaways. The FBI's Operation Rhino was already in motion. The connections had already been made between missing persons reports and overseas travel, between overseas travel and al-Shabab, between al-Shabab and a community of young men in Minneapolis who were being systematically targeted. Within days of Yonis's report, the question of where Abdikadir had gone would have moved beyond the Hopkins Police Department entirely. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, an ocean away from the quiet suburb where a mother was discovering that a passport she kept in her home was not, in fact, the only passport her son had possessed, Abdikadir Ali Abdi was landing in Somalia. To understand what that landing felt like, You have to understand what Somalia was in November 2008. The country that Somali immigrants in Minnesota described to their children. The Somalia of memory, of stories told around the dinner table, of photographs faded by time and distance, was not the Somalia that existed on the ground in 2008. The civil war that had driven the first wave of refugees to America in the 1990s had never truly ended. It had evolved, mutated, splintered into factions upon factions. By 2008, al-Shabab was not just recruiting in Minneapolis. It was a dominant military force in large parts of southern and central Somalia, fighting to topple the transitional federal government that the African Union and United States were propping up. The Ethiopian military, which had invaded in 2006, was still present in parts of the country. The streets of Mogadishu were defined by checkpoints and gunfire and the constant negotiation of survival. The recruits from Minnesota, according to the documented record, were met in Mogadishu by al-Shabab contacts upon arrival. They did not land and wander. The pipeline that began in a pizza restaurant private dining room in Minneapolis extended all the way to the arrivals floor of Aden Abdul International Airport. There were people waiting, and those people had a plan. What happened in the days and weeks after arrival, the processing, the indoctrination, the assignment to training, follows a pattern that emerged through the testimony of the young men who eventually returned to the United States and cooperated with prosecutors. They were moved quickly, taken to areas where al-Shabab operated, introduced to fighters and commanders, moved through a version of intake that stripped away their civilian identity and began replacing it with the identity of a soldier, a believer, a warrior for the cause. Ahmed Ali Omar, who had arrived in late 2007, was already present when Abdikadir arrived in late 2008. Omar would later describe what the experience was like, speaking to VOA's investigative dossier more than a decade after the fact, with the particular tone of a man who has had years to reckon with his own role in his own story. He said that he would have been killed or jailed if he had tried to leave during the years he was active in the organization. He said the group monitored its members, watched them, controlled the information they had access to, created a closed world in which the organization's ideology was the only lens through which events could be understood. What strikes you, reading the accounts that emerged in 2020, is the phrase Abdikadir used to describe the thinking that led him to Somalia. Youth is more like action, not talk. It is the language of someone who believed, genuinely believed, in the mission he was joining. Not a person who went in eyes wide shut, fully aware he was walking into manipulation. He believed. He had been persuaded to believe. And the machinery of belief, once it starts running inside a 17-year-old boy who has been surrounded by trusted adults confirming and amplifying that belief, that machinery is almost impossible to stop from the outside. Back in Hopkins, back in Minneapolis, the families were beginning to understand what had happened. Yonis Abdi's testimony at the 2012 trial of Muhammad said Omar gives a glimpse into what those early days felt like. He had not known. He had not seen his brother with any recruiters. He had not seen warning signs. Or if he had not known they were warning signs. The passport his family kept was still in the house, which means the second passport, the one Abdikadir used, had been obtained in secret. The mailing address used on that passport application was a location the family never lived at. Someone else had managed that detail. Someone who knew how to do this. Someone who had done it before. The shockwave hit the Somali community in Minneapolis in stages. First came the missing persons reports. Then came the FBI. Then came the slow, terrible revelation that this was not a handful of isolated incidents, but a coordinated pipeline that had been operating for over a year. The community processed it the way communities process incomprehensible things, with grief, with denial, with anger, with the particular kind of shame that comes from knowing that the world is watching and the world is going to draw its own conclusions. It affected the community negatively, said Abdirahman Mukhtar, a community activist who knew many of the young men who traveled. Some in the community described the recruits as brainwashed. Others said they were manipulated by pro-al-Shabab locals. Some were furious. Some were heartbroken. A few, though they would never say it publicly, understood, on some level, the pull of what had been offered. Because to understand is not to excuse. It is to see clearly. And the community leaders who were most effective in confronting this crisis were the ones who could see clearly, who acknowledged the vulnerability that had been exploited without absolving the exploitation. Abdi Rizik Bihi, a community leader whose nephew Burhan Hassan was one of the young men who left, became one of the most visible advocates in this period. He sat in the back row of the federal courtroom throughout Muhammad said Omar's trial, close to the door, as if he might need to leave at any moment. His nephew was 17 when he left. He was shot and killed in Somalia in June 2009. Bihi said the hardest part was that the man who helped facilitate his nephew's departure was not a stranger. He was someone the community knew. It is not part of our culture, Bihi said, where a neighbor is nice to you and saying hi to you, the same as he has done for several years, every morning, and then you come to find out that morning he was taking your loved one to the airport to join al-Shabab. 17 years old, in both cases. Burhan Hassan, Abdikadir Ali Abdi, both 17 when they left Minnesota. One would be dead within months. The other would survive, barely, and at tremendous cost, and would spend the next 17 years living the consequences. By the time the FBI formally identified Abdikadir Ali Abdi as someone who had traveled overseas and potentially joined al-Shabab, the investigation had confirmed that 6 young men from Minnesota had already died in Somalia. 6 families who received the news in different ways, some from the FBI, some from relatives in Somalia, some from grainy photographs that circulated on the internet and were identified, with devastating certainty, by mothers who knew their children's faces. Abdikadir Ali Abdi was not dead, but what he was living, that would take years to fully emerge. Because Somalia in 2008 was not the homeland that al-Shabaab's propaganda videos had shown. It was not a place of brotherhood and purpose and righteous resistance. It was a place where 17-year-old boys from Minnesota, who had grown up going to Somali malls and praying with their brothers and wearing gray sweaters on November nights, were handed weapons and given orders and moved into a world so far from everything they had known that the distance couldn't even be measured in miles. It could only be measured in what it cost them, and the bill had barely started coming due. There is a particular cruelty that belongs to the gap between expectation and reality, the specific agony of arriving at the thing you were promised and finding something unrecognizable in its place. For the young men from Minnesota who had been fed a vision of honorable resistance, of Muslim brotherhood, of a homeland being defended, the gap between that vision and the physical reality of al-Shabab in Somalia in 2008 and 2009 was not a gap at all. It was a cliff. Al-Shabab was, by 2008, one of the most brutal military organizations operating anywhere on Earth. It had begun, in an earlier incarnation, as part of the Islamic Courts Union, a loose alliance of Sharia courts that had, briefly, brought something resembling order to parts of Somalia in 2006. When the Ethiopian invasion scattered that coalition, al-Shabab emerged as the most hardline splinter group, with the deepest ties to al-Qaeda and the most willingness to use violence not just against external enemies, but against anyone it deemed insufficiently obedient. Its internal culture was built on fear. Absolute obedience was required. Any deviation, any question, any dissent, any behavior that could be characterized as disloyalty, was punishable by imprisonment or death. The organization ran with the logic of a closed system. You were given an ideology that explained the world, enemies that justified your violence, and a hierarchy that controlled every aspect of your life. Leaving was not a concept that existed within that system. Leaving was betrayal, and betrayal had only one consequence. For a 17-year-old from Hopkins, Minnesota, a boy who had spent his life between two worlds and had finally been sold a version of belonging that felt real, this was the true landscape of the decision he had made. Ahmed Ali Omar, speaking in the 2020 VOA interview, described the psychological architecture of life inside al-Shabab with the measured tone of someone who has had years to process what he experienced. He said the organization found out that he and Abdikadir were beginning to go against their extremist, rigid views and were plotting to arrest them. This was not a metaphor. Al-Shabab regularly detained, imprisoned, and executed members it suspected of ideological drift. The young men from Minnesota were not just recruits. They were also hostages, in a sense, to the decision they had made. The very act of joining had foreclosed other options. The physical conditions were nothing like what had been presented. Training camps in rural Somalia. Weapons that needed to be cleaned and carried in heat that was punishing after the cold of a Minnesota winter. Commands in Arabic, which many of the American recruits didn't fully speak. Food that was scarce. Sleep that was interrupted by the sounds of conflict. And surrounding it all, a constant enforcement of ideological purity that left no room for the complexity of thought that had, in fact, driven many of these young men to this point. Because the young men who came from Minnesota were not, by the accounts that eventually emerged, ideologically simple. They were struggling with identity, with belonging, with questions about their place in the world and their obligations to their community. Those are complex questions. Al-Shabab did not have complex answers. Al-Shabab had one answer, repeated in every context, applied to every situation: submit, obey, fight. The richness of the questions that had driven them here was not only unwelcome in this new environment, it was dangerous. And then there was the violence. In June 2009, roughly 7 months after Abdikadir arrived, a 17-year-old Minnesota recruit named Boran Ibrahim Hassan was shot and killed by an al-Shabab bodyguard. The circumstances were almost absurdly arbitrary. Hassan had been walking near the house of a senior al-Shabab commander named Yusuf Isi Kabakutakade. A bodyguard shot him, claiming that Hassan had compromised the safety of the official. According to accounts that Abdikadir and Omar would later give to journalists, they arrived at the scene of the shooting within minutes. They saw what had happened to their peer, their fellow Minnesotan, a boy who had left America at the same age Abdikadir had. The commander, Kabakutakade, promised to pay blood money to Hassan's family. The blood money never came. Hassan's family in Minneapolis never received a single dollar. They said their choice was that the person who pulled the trigger should be put to death by the group. That, too, never happened. What does it do to you, standing at the scene of that, at 17 or 18 years old, in a country you barely know, surrounded by men who killed a boy and offered nothing but empty promises? What does it do to the ideology you carried here? What happens to the belief system when you watch it eat one of its own, and then look around and realize that no one is going to say a word? Abdikadir would not speak of this moment publicly for more than a decade. But when he and Omar finally spoke to VOA in 2020, the weight of it was present in every word. They had seen things. They had done things. The record of the federal charges against them: conspiracy to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization, conspiracy to kill, kidnap, maim, and injure people outside the United States, possessing and discharging a firearm during a crime of violence, solicitation to commit a crime of violence. These are not administrative charges. These are charges that describe the acts of people who were participants in an armed organization. They were not observers. They were not innocent bystanders who stumbled into a war zone. They joined. They participated. And the federal government has never forgotten that. At the same time, understanding what participation means within al-Shabab requires holding two things simultaneously: the genuine harm that their involvement may have caused, and the profound degree to which 17-year-old boys are capable of being manipulated by sophisticated adult recruitment operations. The courts have a framework for this. The moral universe that most of us inhabit is less tidy. Both things can be true. The accountability and the context can coexist, even when they are uncomfortable together. Back in Minnesota, the FBI was building its case. Operation Rhino was expanding. Court documents were multiplying. An FBI affidavit filed in late 2009 confirmed that 6 Minnesota recruits had been confirmed dead in Somalia. Others were believed to be alive and active, including some who had risen into leadership positions within the organization. Abdikadir Ali Abdi's name was in the files, on the FBI's wanted list, on a federal charging document. A fugitive, in the eyes of the law, who had provided material support to an organization that killed people. The Somali community in Minneapolis was living under a scrutiny that felt to many like suffocation. The federal investigation was necessary. No serious person doubted that a recruitment pipeline had existed and that it needed to be dismantled. But the investigation's shadow fell across an entire community, the overwhelming majority of which had nothing to do with any of this. Parents of teenagers who had no interest in Somalia were suddenly afraid. Men who prayed at mosques where recruiters had once operated were suddenly fielding questions from neighbors, from law enforcement, from journalists who had descended on Cedar Riverside and Hopkins and every other Somali majority neighborhood looking for the story. They described them as brainwashed young men, VOA's reporting noted, but others said pro-al-Shabab locals manipulated them. The community was not monolithic in its response. It never is. But there was a common grief, for the families of boys who had gone, for the boys themselves, for the reputation of a community that had come to America to build something and found itself, through no fault of its own majority, associated with a terrorist organization that a small number of its young men had joined. And somewhere in Somalia, in a war that was being waged with automatic weapons and IEDs and suicide bombers, in a climate and a culture that bore no resemblance to anything he had grown up knowing, Abdikadir Ali Abdi was surviving. Year after year, growing from 17 to 18 to 19 to 20. From a teenager in a gray sweater to a man who had been shaped by violence and deprivation and the terrible clarity that comes from watching people die for something you once believed in. He was alive, but the version of himself that had walked out the door in Hopkins was not. That boy was gone, and the man who was beginning to form in his place was carrying a weight that would define everything that came next. While Abdikadir Ali Abdi was learning what al-Shabab actually was, while he was moving through training camps and carrying weapons in the Somali heat, and watching his peer from Minneapolis get shot dead in the street, the United States government was building a case that would follow him for the rest of his life. The federal response to what had happened in Minnesota was unlike anything the counterterrorism apparatus had seen before. This was not a plot that had been discovered and disrupted before it could unfold. This was a pipeline that had already operated for years, that had already moved more than 20 people across international borders and into the ranks of a designated terrorist organization. By the time the FBI fully understood the scope of what had happened, multiple young men were already dead. Multiple others were believed to be active within al-Shabab. And the recruiters, the adults who had designed and operated the system, were still, for the most part, free. Operation Rhino became one of the largest domestic terrorism investigations in the country. The FBI worked in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, with Homeland Security, with Hennepin County law enforcement, with international partners. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were subpoenaed. Phone records were traced. Passport applications were examined, including the ones that showed the same suspicious mailing addresses that had nothing to do with the applicants' actual families. By 2010, the FBI had placed Abdikadir Ali Abdi on its official wanted list under the category of individuals sought for providing material support to al-Shabab. His photograph, taken from whatever records the government had on file, the face of a teenager, appeared on the FBI's website alongside a physical description: black hair, black eyes, last known wearing a gray sweater. A federal warrant was in place. If he returned to American soil, he would be arrested. The charges themselves, when they were eventually formalized, painted a picture of the scope of what the government believed he had done. Conspiracy to provide material support to terrorists. Conspiracy to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization. Conspiracy to kill, kidnap, maim, and injure persons outside the United States. Possessing and discharging a firearm during a crime of violence. Solicitation to commit a crime of violence. These are not charges that leave much room for the nuance of youth or manipulation. They are charges designed for adults who made choices. And however complicated the context of those choices was, the law does not easily accommodate complexity. The pressure the investigation placed on the Minneapolis Somali community was enormous and, for many, deeply unjust. The FBI's presence was constant. Informants were placed within community institutions. Mosque attendance was monitored. Community leaders found themselves in the impossible position of wanting to cooperate with law enforcement to prevent further recruitment, genuinely wanting that, because they had watched their sons and nephews and brothers get swallowed by this pipeline, while also fighting against a surveillance apparatus that treated their entire community as suspect. The federal government made promises, said Mohammed Farah, executive director of Kajug, a nonprofit serving Somali youth in Minnesota. Nothing came of it. The community needed funding for youth programs, for jobs, for mental health support, for the kind of robust intervention infrastructure that could actually interrupt the radicalization process before it got started. What it got, primarily, was surveillance. And surveillance, experts noted, does not by itself dismantle the conditions that make recruitment possible. There was also the media. The story of the Minneapolis pipeline was, from a journalistic perspective, irresistible. The American heartland, an immigrant community, a terrorist group, missing teenagers. Reporters descended. Cameras rolled. The Cedar Riverside neighborhood, with its distinctive mix of Somali storefronts and hijab-wearing women and men in kufis, became a backdrop for national news segments trying to explain how the largest Somali community in America had produced suicide bombers. The coverage was not always fair. It was rarely complete. And the effect on ordinary Somali Americans, people who had nothing to do with al-Shabab, who had come to America precisely to escape the kind of violence al-Shabab represented, was damaging in ways that are difficult to fully quantify. Nimco Ahmed, the community activist, gave voice to what many felt. We feel doubly victimized. To lose our children and brothers to terrorism, and to be painted as terrorists ourselves. It was a statement that contained layers. It acknowledged the real loss. Boys who were gone, boys who were dead, families permanently altered. It also named the second violence, the flattening of a whole community into the worst acts of its most manipulated members. At the center of the legal proceedings was the trial of Mohammed Said Omar, the mosque janitor who had been extradited from the Netherlands and who sat in a Minneapolis federal courtroom in the fall of 2012 while the families of the young men he had helped recruit, in some cases physically driven to the airport, filed into the gallery and sat in the rows behind him. Abaid Ahmed, whose son Jamal Sheikh Bana had died in Somalia with a bullet wound to the head, turned her face away when prosecutors displayed the photographs. She was testifying through an interpreter. She said she had no idea her son had planned to leave. He had called her from Somalia about 8 days after he disappeared, called her to tell her where he was, from a country that had already closed behind him like a door. Yonis Abdi, Abdikadir's brother, also testified. He told the court he had not known his brother was traveling. He said he had never seen his brother with Mohammed Said Omar. He said he last saw Abdikadir on November 2nd. He said their family had not heard from him since. Not one call. Not one message. A silence that had now stretched years. Omar was convicted on all charges, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. But the conviction, while significant, could not undo what had already been done. The young men who had left were gone. The ones who had died could not come back. The ones who were still alive, scattered across Somalia, some in hiding, some still active, remained beyond reach. And then there was a detail that emerged from the FBI's expanding case files that changed the nature of the story entirely. Not all of the Minnesota recruits had died. Not all of them had remained with al-Shabab. And not all of them had gone silent. The FBI affidavit confirmed that some of the Minnesota travelers had, in fact, risen into leadership positions or significant duties within al-Shabab. That meant that the young men who had left, boys who had attended secret pizza restaurant meetings and been driven to airports by middle-aged men they trusted, had not remained peripheral to the organization. Some of them had become it. Had become the kind of figures who would, in a later generation, be sitting across from the next batch of vulnerable teenagers, doing what was done to them. That circularity is the most brutal part of the whole machinery. Abdikadir Ali Abdi's status during those years, his exact role, his level of activity, what he was ordered to do and what he chose to do, is not fully documented in the public record. The federal charges give a legal framework. The 2020 interview gives his own account, filtered through years of reflection and through the obvious strategic consideration that speaking publicly was, in part, an act of distancing himself from the organization. What can be said is that he survived, that he lasted more than a decade in an organization that killed its members for far less than the ideological drift he and Omar eventually developed. To survive al-Shabab for more than a decade is not a passive accomplishment. It required something. Compliance, at minimum. And the charges against him suggest something more than compliance. Back in Hopkins, the house where he had grown up was still there. His mother's house, where the family passport sat undisturbed. His brother Yonis, who had reported his disappearance to the police all those years ago, was building his own life. The Somali community in Minneapolis was trying to rebuild trust, with law enforcement, with the broader American public, with itself. And Abdikadir Ali Abdi, now in his late 20s, was living somewhere in Somalia, in an organization he had begun to question, unable to go back and unable to fully go forward. There is a phrase that comes up in discussions of radicalization, the concept of a point of no return. Researchers debate whether such a point truly exists, whether de-radicalization is always possible, whether ideology can ever be fully dismantled. But there is a different kind of point of no return that has nothing to do with ideology. It is the legal point, the jurisdictional point. The moment when the choices you have made have generated a charging document with your name on it, and a federal warrant for your arrest, and no statute of limitations to protect you. For Abdikadir Ali Abdi, that point had come and gone years before he started questioning anything. America was waiting for him, in the worst possible way. There is a specific moment in the arc of every true believer, not just in terrorist organizations, but in cults, in abusive relationships, in any closed system built on absolute ideology, when a crack appears. It is rarely a dramatic revelation. It is rarely a single event so terrible that it shatters everything at once. More often it is cumulative. A series of small inconsistencies. A series of moments when the doctrine and the reality fail to align. A series of quiet observations that, in any other context, would be allowed to develop into questions, into doubt, into the full expression of moral intelligence, but which, in a closed and violent system, must be suppressed before they can form, because to let them form is to risk death. For Abdikadir Ali Abdi and Ahmed Ali Omar, the cracks had probably been forming for years before they became visible enough to act on. The shooting of Burhan Hassan in June 2009 was almost certainly one of those cracks. Watching a 17-year-old boy from Minneapolis shot dead in the street, shot by the bodyguard of a commander who then promised blood money and delivered nothing, is not something that slides easily into any framework of righteous resistance. It is something that sits in the body, that sits in the mind, that comes back at 3 in the morning in whatever shelter you're sleeping in whatever corner of Somalia you've been deployed to. Al-Shabab's internal trajectory in the years after 2009 made the cracks harder to ignore. The organization had, in its early framing, positioned itself as a nationalist resistance movement, defending Somali land from Ethiopian occupation, protecting Somali Muslims from foreign military intervention. That framing had been the hook. That was what had moved young men in Minneapolis from frustrated observer to committed participant. But al-Shabab, as the years passed, became something that could no longer be dressed in nationalist clothing no matter how hard its propaganda machine worked. In 2011, the organization formally joined al-Qaeda, not a resistance coalition, not a nationalist militia, but the global jihadist network that had claimed responsibility for the September 11th attacks that had defined the entire troubled American childhood of the young men who had joined it. That formalization of the al-Qaeda alliance would have been difficult to process through the original ideological frame. The young men from Minnesota had been told they were going home to defend their homeland. They had not been told they were enlisting in the same organization that had changed the world on September 11th, 2001. The same event that had made their lives in Minnesota harder, that had generated the suspicion and the othering and the weight of being Muslim in post-9/11 America, that had made them vulnerable to recruitment in the first place. The circularity of that was a horror all its own. Meanwhile, al-Shabab's internal governance grew increasingly brutal. The organization conducted purges. Senior figures were assassinated by their own colleagues. Foreign fighters, the Americans, the Europeans, the Australians who had arrived with idealism and propaganda-fueled expectation, were viewed with deepening suspicion by some elements of the organization's leadership. Some were detained. Some were killed. The foreign recruits occupied an uneasy position, valued for the propaganda value of their American passports and English-speaking faces, but distrusted as people who might, ultimately, remember where they came from. Omar told VOA in 2020 that the group had found out that he and Abdikadir were going against their extremist, rigid views and were plotting to arrest them. The use of the word plotting is significant. It is the language of a covert internal intelligence operation. Al-Shabab watched its members. It had informants within its own ranks. It assessed ideological reliability continuously. And when it determined that a member was developing doubts, it moved to contain that person before the doubts could spread. To leave al-Shabab alive was, by the accounts of multiple defectors and researchers, nearly impossible without either extraordinary cunning or external help. The organization's response to defection was historically execution. Members who tried to leave were tracked down. Those who fled to areas outside al-Shabab control could sometimes reach the Somali government's territory. The transitional federal government, later the federal government of Somalia, had its own complicated relationship with al-Shabab defectors, sometimes absorbing them, sometimes using them for intelligence, sometimes simply providing physical protection in exchange for information. Omar and Abdi left al-Shabab approximately 16 months before their January 2020 VOA interview, placing their departure in roughly late 2018 or early 2019. The exact circumstances of how they managed to leave an organization known for hunting down defectors are not fully disclosed in the public reporting. What is documented is that by the time they gave their interview, they were living in a house in Mogadishu provided by Somalia's National Intelligence and Security Agency, the Somali equivalent of being in protective custody. They were out of al-Shabab. They were alive. They were being protected by the Somali state. But they were not free. Freedom, as it turned out, was the thing that no one had a home for anymore. What does it feel like to spend more than a decade inside an organization, to carry out its orders, to survive its internal violence, to watch peers die, and to keep moving, and then to find your way out, and to discover that the exit leads not to safety, but to a kind of statelessness? They were in Mogadishu. They were Somali. They were alive. But they were still wanted by the FBI, still carrying the weight of federal charges that described, in clinical legal language, acts committed during years they would spend the rest of their lives reckoning with. They were free from al-Shabab and imprisoned by the consequences of having joined it. And back in Minnesota, their families were still waiting. Yonis Abdi had last seen his brother on November 2, 2008. More than a decade had passed. The Hopkins house where they had grown up. The Somali mall they had visited together. The mosque where they had prayed side by side. All of it was still there, unchanged in the way that places are unchanged while the people who move through them are transformed beyond recognition. There is a question that sits at the center of this whole story that cannot be answered with data or court documents or even the honest testimony of the people involved. It is a question about interiority, about what Abdikadir was like inside, not in 2008, when he left, and not in 2020, when he spoke to journalists, but in the years in between, in the training camps, and the fighting, and the survival, and the slow accumulation of doubt. Was there a moment when he understood, clearly and without qualification, what he had walked into? Was there a moment when he thought about Hopkins, about his brother, about the family who didn't know where he was? Was there grief? Was there something like regret that arrived before the language to express it? We don't know. He hasn't said. And there is a version of human experience, the version that lives in that specific gap between action and articulation, that testimony and journalism and court documents cannot fully reach. What we do know is this. By the time he and Ahmed Ali Omar sat down with VOA's investigative dossier, they were men who had survived something most people cannot imagine, who were living in a form of captivity that had traded one kind of danger for another, who said they would go back to Minneapolis if not for the charges against them, and who described their journey in the understated, exhausted language of people who have been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time. This produced young men who are being influenced by the situation, Abdi said in the 2020 interview, describing what had driven him and others to join. The situation, the word choice, is notable. Not ideology, not conviction. The situation, the context, the specific constellation of pressures and vulnerabilities and manipulations that made al-Shabab's pitch sound, at 17, like the only answer in the room. He was 31 years old when he said those words. He had been gone from Hopkins for 12 years. And in the community that had known him, the community that was still living with the aftermath of everything that had happened, the reaction to the news of his and Omar's defection was not simple. Community activist Abdirahman Mukhtar said leaders were relieved that young men are seeing the light even after such a long time. But relief is not the same as resolution. Relief does not erase the charges, does not close the federal warrant, does not undo the years, does not bring back Boran Hassan or any of the other 6 young men from Minneapolis who died in Somalia and whose families never received the blood money they were promised. The disillusionment that Abdikadir Ali Abdi and Ahmed Ali Omar developed inside al-Shabab was genuine. The renunciation they made public in 2020 appears to have been genuine. The terror they felt, of retaliation from al-Shabab, of prosecution by the United States, of the two-sided trap that their 17-year-old decision had constructed around them, was unambiguously real. But genuine regret and legal accountability are not the same thing. And the United States government was not in the business of accepting public renunciations in lieu of standing trial. The interview ran in January 2020 on VOA's Somali language program, Investigative Dossier. 2 men, a camera, a room in Mogadishu, in a house provided by Somalia's National Intelligence and Security Agency. And for the first time in over a decade, the voices of 2 young men who had walked away from Minnesota in their teenage years were captured on record, not by a federal prosecutor, not by an FBI interrogator, but by a journalist asking them to tell their own story. Ahmed Ali Omar spoke first, by most accounts. He was the older of the 2. He had been 19 when he left Minnesota in late 2007 and was now in his early 30s. He said what so many defectors from violent extremist organizations eventually say, when the moment finally comes and the words that have been building for years find their way out. The group was going to kill him. That was why he left. It wasn't a conversion narrative, not exactly. Not the story of a man who woke up one morning and saw the light and walked out the door into the sunshine of moral clarity. It was survival. They found out he and Abdikadir were questioning the ideology. The organization began moving to neutralize them. So they got out before the organization could act. They found out we were going against their extremist, rigid views, Omar said, and they were plotting to arrest us. Abdikadir Ali Abdi, in his own words during the interview, offered the most direct window into the thinking that had taken him to Somalia in the first place. Youth is more like action, not talk, he said. So we thought money is not enough, so we have to do action. He was describing the state of mind of a 17-year-old who had been recruited, a teenager who felt the pull of something that felt bigger than sitting in Minnesota watching events unfold, a teenager who had been persuaded by adults he trusted that the situation demanded action, not words, and that action looked like going to Somalia and picking up a weapon. He was 31 years old when he said those words about being 17. There is a particular quality to a middle-aged person describing the thinking of a teenager they used to be. The mixture of recognition and distance, the slight bewilderment at the certainty that younger self carried, the knowledge that no amount of explanation fully bridges the gap between who you were and who you are now. He was not that 17-year-old anymore. He had not been that 17-year-old for a very long time. The interview was confirmed and verified. VOA's investigators checked their accounts with Somali government officials and with other defectors from al-Shabab who could corroborate the timeline of the 2 men's departure. The defection was real. The renunciation was real. The 2 men were, as of early 2020, living under the protection of the Somali state, not prisoners, but not free men either. Protected from al-Shabab by government security. Unable to leave Somalia without risking arrest. Living in a specific kind of limbo that had no obvious resolution. And then, among the details that Omar and Abdi shared, came the account of Burhan Hassan's death. They said they had been at the scene within minutes. They had watched a 17-year-old from their own community, a boy from Minneapolis, just like them, shot dead by a bodyguard because he had walked near the wrong house. They described how Kaba Kutakade, the commander responsible, had promised blood money to Hassan's family. They described how the family in Minneapolis had never received $1. How the person who pulled the trigger had never faced consequences. And how this specific incident, this specific exercise in organizational impunity and callous disregard for the life of a young American recruit, sat with them. What do you do with that in the moment? When you are a Minnesota teenager inside an organization that has just killed another Minnesota teenager and shown nothing but contempt for the consequences. When the blood money promise is clearly a gesture and nothing more. When you look around and realize that you, too, are expendable. That the same logic that determined Burhan Hassan could be walked near the wrong house and shot dead could, just as easily, be applied to you? You don't leave. Not immediately. Because you can't. Because leaving means death. Because the door out is guarded. Because you have nowhere to go that doesn't end in an al-Shabab cell or a federal prison cell or both. So you stay. You carry the weight of what you know. You perform the required ideology while the doubt grows underneath it. Careful, persistent, survivalist. And you wait. The waiting lasted years. Omar's brother Gould, who had remained in Minneapolis, eventually traveled to Syria to join ISIS. A different organization, a different war, the same devastating pattern, and was convicted in an American federal court for conspiring to commit murder on behalf of ISIL and providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Ahmed Ali Omar's brother, sitting in an American prison cell. The ripple effects of this story did not stop at international borders. They came home. They landed on the families that had been left behind. Both Abdikadir and Omar said, in the 2020 interview, that they had family in the Minneapolis area, that they wanted to go back, that if not for the federal charges, they would return. This is a complicated thing to sit with, because the desire to return and the acknowledgement of what return would mean and the continued reality of the charges waiting for them if they did return are all simultaneously true. They are not claiming innocence. They are not denying that they were part of al-Shabab. They are saying that they are out, that they renounce it, that the decade plus they spent inside it ruined their future, and that they are now caught in a trap they cannot escape. This deadly adventure ruined their future, was how VOA characterized the story. And the word adventure is worth pausing on, because that is, in some dark way, exactly how al-Shabab's recruitment had framed it to them at 17. An adventure, a mission, a chance to be part of something larger than the small, constrained life of a second-generation immigrant in a suburb of Minneapolis. The adventure had been real. It had also been a catastrophe. In Mogadishu, they waited. The al-Shabab threat did not disappear just because they had defected and been given government housing. Al-Shabab has a long memory and a demonstrated willingness to kill defectors, particularly defectors who speak to journalists, who go on record, who publicly identify as people who have left and renounced the organization. Every interview is a risk calculation. Every public statement is a potential target for the organization they left. And then there is the other threat, more distant, less immediate, but no less real. The United States government. The FBI wanted list. The federal charges. The knowledge that the country where their families still lived, the country where they had grown up, was waiting for them with a set of charges that carried the potential for decades of imprisonment. Both threats real. Both unresolvable. Living between them, in a house in Mogadishu, in a country that is their homeland, and also the place that destroyed their adolescence. Abdikadir Ali Abdi's family in Hopkins, his mother, his brother Yonis, whoever else remained, had received no word from him in years. Yonis testified in 2012 that the family had heard nothing. The 2020 interview does not include any confirmed account of renewed contact with family in Minnesota. The silence between Abdikadir and the people who loved him has lasted, as far as the public record shows, from November 2008 to the present. What does a mother do with that? What does a brother do with that? A brother who went to the Hopkins police all those years ago, who testified in federal court, who told a jury that he had never seen his sibling with the man they were trying to convict, who went home afterward to a house where the memories of a shared childhood existed in photographs and small objects, and the particular ache of an absence that has no resolution. The psychological toll of years in hiding, of living under threat from two directions, of carrying the weight of what you did and what was done to you, of being unable to go home and unsure where home even is anymore, is not something that can be fully described from the outside. Researchers who study former combatants from violent extremist organizations describe patterns: hypervigilance, chronic anxiety, a profound difficulty with trust, the particular disorientation of existing in a world where you no longer know what your identity is or what it is allowed to be. He left at 17. He is now, in 2026, somewhere in his mid-30s. The gray sweater is long gone. What's left is a man who made a decision when he was barely old enough to understand the weight of decisions. A decision that was not made in a vacuum, that was shaped and enabled and facilitated by adults who knew exactly what they were doing, and who has been living with the consequences ever since. Whether he has tried to contact his family, whether there are channels of communication that have remained private, whether there is some version of a relationship that exists outside the public record, none of that is known. What is known is the last confirmed public statement. A camera in Mogadishu. A voice saying that youth is more like action, not talk. A man who wanted, once, to do something real, and who now lives in a house provided by an intelligence agency, in a city that is not the one where he grew up, unable to go back to the life he left. That is where the story stands as of this recording. And it is not a story with a clean ending. Every story like this one has a version that could be told purely as a crime story, as a narrative about a terrorist organization and the people who joined it and the law enforcement that investigated it. And that version would be true, but it would not be complete. Because running parallel to the story of Abdikadir Ali Abdi and al-Shabab is a story about America, about what America does and fails to do with the children of people it has offered refuge. Minnesota's Somali community did not produce al-Shabab recruits because it was uniquely dangerous or uniquely radicalized or uniquely anything. It produced recruits because it was the largest Somali diaspora in the United States, which meant it was the largest pool of young men who met the profile that al-Shabab's recruiters had identified. Second-generation immigrants, caught between two cultures, uncertain of belonging in either, carrying the anger of people who feel perpetually othered, and reachable through a combination of in-person manipulation and online propaganda that was, by 2007, more sophisticated than anything American law enforcement had previously encountered. The profile was not exotic. It was familiar to anyone who had spent time inside the community. Community leaders knew which young men were struggling. They knew who was falling behind in school, who was unemployed, who was spending too much time in the wrong company. What they lacked was resources, the youth programs, the mental health support, the job pathways, the adult mentorship that could have intercepted vulnerable teenagers before the recruiters did. Mohammed Farah of Kajug said the federal government made promises and didn't follow through. The community had the local knowledge and the community relationships that law enforcement could never fully replicate. What it didn't have was money, infrastructure. Political will translate it into actual funding. Instead, it got surveillance. This is not to say the surveillance was unnecessary. The FBI's Operation Rhino dismantled a recruitment pipeline that had already moved 20-plus young men overseas, and that, left undisturbed, would have continued. The prosecution of Mohammed said Omar and the network around him was a legitimate exercise of law enforcement responding to a genuine threat. But the long-term strategy for prevention, the work that goes beyond the arrest and conviction of recruiters and addresses the conditions that make recruitment possible, that work requires a different kind of institutional commitment. A commitment to the young people themselves, to the families, to the community as a partner rather than a suspect. The failure to fully make that commitment in the years following the initial crisis is part of why the problem didn't disappear. It evolved. By 2013, a new recruiting pipeline had emerged, this one not for al-Shabab but for ISIS, sending young Somali Americans not to Somalia, but to Syria. Different destination, same machinery, same vulnerabilities, same communities, same failures of prevention. The FBI arrested 6 Minnesota men in 2015 for attempting to travel to Syria to join the Islamic State. Their families told the same stories that Abdikadir Abdi's family told in 2008. We didn't know. We didn't see it coming. The passport arrived in the mail, and we took it away. I cry all day. The cycle was not broken. It was inherited. Why Minnesota? The honest answer is both structural and demographic. The largest Somali community in the country, concentrated in a small geographic area, struggling with the specific pressures of second-generation immigrant identity in a post-9/11 American context. An insular community that had, by design and by necessity, built parallel institutions, Somali malls, Somali insurance offices, Somali community centers, that sustained identity, but also, inadvertently, created a relatively self-contained social world that was easier for recruiters to move through. A community that was, simultaneously, deeply religious and deeply American, navigating a national moment in which those two identities were being aggressively constructed as incompatible. Counterterrorism experts who were consulted during the wave of prosecutions consistently made a point that is easy to overlook in the noise of arrests and charges. Radicalization is not primarily a theological phenomenon. It is a social and psychological one. The young men who joined al-Shabab were not, for the most part, unusually devout. They were not religious scholars who had studied extremist theology and found it persuasive. They were teenagers with identity crises who were offered a framework for their anger and a community of belonging and a sense of purpose, and who happened to receive all of those things from a terrorist organization, Because the terrorist organization was better funded and better organized and more present in their lives than the institutions that might have offered those same things in a healthier form. Radicalization programs, the kind that work, the kind that have been documented in context from Germany to Indonesia, address the social and psychological needs directly. They offer young people alternative communities, alternative frameworks for purpose, alternative ways of being part of something larger than themselves. They treat former combatants not only as subjects for prosecution, but as human beings with the capacity for genuine change. They acknowledge the complexity of what happened while maintaining accountability for its consequences. The United States has been slower than some other countries to develop this infrastructure. The Minneapolis pilot program, Building Community Resilience, launched around 2014 and involved genuine community partnership. Meetings with religious leaders, youth leaders, mothers, mental health professionals, community elders. It was a start. It was funded, but it was also underfunded and under-resourced relative to the scope of the problem it was trying to address. And then there is the specific, unresolved question at the heart of this case. What do you do with the people who actually left? With the Abdikadir Ali Abdis and the Ahmed Ali Omars who are now living in Mogadishu, in houses provided by a Somali intelligence agency, genuinely outside al-Shabab, publicly renouncing it, saying they want to go home? There is no easy answer. The charges against them describe real acts. Material support for terrorism is not a victimless crime. Whatever Abdikadir did during the decade he spent inside al-Shabab, and the charges suggest that it went beyond passive membership. There are consequences to be accounted for. The law does not have a provision for, I was 17 and manipulated by adults, and I eventually saw the truth. That is a mitigating factor. It is not an absolution. But there is also the question of what justice actually looks like in cases like this. Is it best served by a decades-long federal prison sentence for a man who left at 17, who was recruited by adults, who eventually defected at personal risk, who has publicly renounced the organization? Or is there a version of justice that includes some pathway toward accountability that doesn't require decades of incarceration? These are questions that legal scholars, policymakers, and advocates for de-radicalization have been asking for years, without reaching consensus. And there is the question of what it costs a family to have this be unresolved indefinitely. Yonis Abdi, who went to the Hopkins police in November 2008 and has been living with the silence ever since. The mother who kept a passport in her house, not knowing there was a second one. The community that lost, as Nimco Ahmed put it, some of our best and brightest, not to death, in Abdikadir's case, but to an absence that is in some ways more complicated than death because it has no boundary, no moment of closure, no clear ending that allows grief to move forward. When a child disappears into extremism, everyone loses something. That is the reality this story leaves behind. Not a villain's story, though villains exist in it. The recruiters, the handlers, the adults who drove teenagers to airports and collected the benefit of their sacrifice. Not a hero's story, though there are those who try to stop it. The community leaders, the parents who confronted the FBI even when they feared what it would mean, the advocates who kept pushing for prevention programs when the government kept offering surveillance instead. It is something messier and more human than either of those categories. It is the story of a boy who was vulnerable at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the wrong environment, surrounded by exactly the wrong people, and who walked out a door and never came back. He is 34 or 35 years old now, as best as can be estimated from the documented record. He is somewhere in Somalia. He is hiding from an organization that wants him dead in a country that wants to prosecute him. He has been outside the gray sweater and the Hopkins suburb and the mosque where he prayed with his brother for 17 years. Whether he will ever be able to return, whether some legal pathway will open, whether some deal will be struck, whether the charges will be superseded or resolved in some form that allows for something resembling resolution, none of that is currently known. The federal charges remain active. The FBI wanted listing remains in place. The case, in all the ways that matter most, remains open. What we can say, what the research and the testimony and the community accounts and the 2020 interview all converge on, is that this story is not over. Not for Abdikadir Ali Abdi, wherever he is. Not for his family in Hopkins. Not for the Minneapolis community that is still, in 2026, navigating the aftermath of a recruitment crisis that began nearly 20 years ago and whose ripples have never fully settled. And not for the question at the center of all of it. The question that counterterrorism experts and community leaders and parents and policymakers have been asking since the first young man disappeared in 2007, and that nobody has yet fully answered. How do you reach a teenager before someone else does? How do you offer belonging before a terrorist organization offers it first? How do you give purpose before the wrong people give it for you? 17 years ago, a boy in a gray sweater walked away from a quiet street in Hopkins, Minnesota. He was searching for something. He had been told he would find it in Somalia. What he found instead was a decade of violence, of doubt, of survival, of disillusionment, of hiding. And what he left behind was a family in silence, a community in grief, and a question that still hangs in the cold Minnesota air. Will he ever come home? If you've made it to the end of this video, I want to say, genuinely, thank you. Stories like this one matter. They matter because the boy in this story was a real person. His family is real. The community that lost him is real. And the conditions that made any of this possible are real and ongoing and worth understanding. If this video moved you, if it made you think, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about stories told with truth and depth. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we go deep on the cases and stories that deserve more than a headline. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. This is the kind of story that deserves a conversation. And share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time.